Alrighty, folks, step right up and watch as I perform an incredible magic trick, making tons of people on the internet super mad with just one short video. What's up, folks? Welcome back to Tactical Coordinates. My name is Trevi, and today I have a bit of a more rambly video, maybe a little bit less focused than some of the recent content that I've been doing, but I really wanted to just sit down and talk about this question that's kind of been bugging me for the last couple days. I was on Twitter a couple days ago and reminiscing about some of my past games in the ITC 2020 format, and despite the issues with 8th edition and the enormous balance issues that the game was undergoing at the time, right around the start of 2020, I was remembering that a lot of my games in that ITC format felt way more competitive and tactically interesting to play than the games that I've been playing in GT2020 since its release. So over the last couple of days, I've really been getting to thinking, is it time for 40k to move back to the ITC format? Can we just put the GT format to bed and go back to revising the ITC 2020 packet, which has a lot of advantages over the GT missions that Games Workshop has been pushing? Just anecdotally, I think in the last 10 or so GT games that I've played, I believe that the player who has won the role to go first has won every single one of them. And now, obviously, that's a small sample size and just based entirely on my experience, so you can't really take away any data from that. But just from the gameplay experience that I've been having, it's kind of taken a lot of wind out of my sails, knowing how much of win percentage is tied up in that single role. Just a couple days ago, Goonhammer put out a follow-up article to their meta review, talking about some of the statistics that have been collected up through October 2020 and going into November. And the stats aren't great. They point to an overbearing advantage in win percentage for the player going first, with almost every faction having a below 50% win rate going second, outside a few, those few of which tend to be the top crust of the meta. Harlequins in particular are kind of killing it right now. They're blowing everybody up. So the fact that they have a pretty good go second win rate is not too surprising. They also benefit a lot from the current deployment style. And this imbalance feels insurmountable at this point. I'm going to put a link to the article in the video description. You should absolutely go read it. They go pretty deeply into exactly what's causing this first versus second player win percentage discrepancy. They go into statistics for individual scenarios. Really, the level of analysis is impressive, to say the least. And unfortunately, almost all of it points to the fact that the GT packet going first is almost the same as winning. Now, we started this discussion over on the community Discord channel. There is a link to that in the description down below. If you want to join, come hang out with us and talk some 40k. We play lots of 40k on Tabletop Simulator over there as well. And a couple people were actually unsure of what exactly the ITC format consisted of. And that reminded me that it's been almost 6 months since the last ITC event was run. It's kind of fallen out of the community zeitgeist since Games Workshop pushed its GT format so incredibly hard. Now, ITC stands for the Independent Tournament Circuit, and it is a global ranking system for in-person games of Warhammer 40k at 1,000 points or above, typically focusing on the 2,000 point strike force level and ranking players based on their results in a variety of event types. Typically, doing better in larger events will score you more ITC ranking points and get you higher on the leaderboard, but competing in smaller events like RTTs or Rogue Trader tournaments and local GTs will still get you a pretty reasonable number of points and can put you in the top 1 or 200. Now, ITC also created its own mission format called the Champions format, which was, I think, at its outset sort of an amalgamation of Nova missions and Adepticon, but eventually evolved into its own beast. And a couple times every year, the team over at Frontline Gaming, who runs the Independent Tournament Circuit, would revise the missions and improve them, make the secondary objectives better, try to respond a little bit to whatever metagame was strong at that point. And eventually, I think the 2020 format was the most evolved 40k mission format that at least I've ever played. While it wasn't perfect, it felt very balanced, and it was extremely fun to play. I was also, the entire document was like kept on a Google Drive that the team members would go in and edit every once in a while, which was the most adorable thing. Now, when 9th edition 40k came out, Games Workshop pushed the GT format super duper hard. Every independent tournament announced that they would be moving to the GT format, and Frontline Gaming itself announced that it would no longer be supporting the ITC format, and while you could still play it and submit scores for it, all of their own internal events would be using the GT2020 format. Now, how ITC actually worked was a little bit different than the current GT and Eternal War formats. Just like those formats, it had secondary objectives. So these were 3 objectives that you would pick before the game. There were 2 categories, Maneuver and Seek and Destroy. Seek and Destroy was about killing stuff, and Maneuver is about standing on places on the table. And you were required to pick at least 1 secondary from either category. Then your third one could be a float pick, or you could pick Old School, which gave you Slay the Warlord, Line Breaker, First Strike, and Last Strike, all as 1-point secondaries that you could score. All of the secondaries could score a maximum of 4 points each, and it was for things like blowing up a vehicle, or killing a character, or dealing X number of wounds to infantry, or having models in all 4 table quarters, a lot like the current GT format has. The primary objectives were much different, however. Every turn that you had in ITC, you would score 1 point if you destroyed any enemy units, and you would score 1 point if you hold 1 or more objectives. This meant that a lot of scoring happened at the end of your turn, but then, at the end of each battle round, the player who at that point held the most objectives would score a point, and the player who killed the most units would score a point. This naturally gave the second player a little bit of advantage on scoring, which tended to balance out the attrition advantage that the first player would get. The first player could hit first and deal a lot of damage, take a lot of board space, but then the second player could then react to their positioning to try to get the hold more and kill more points. That meant that you could score a maximum of 4 primary points every turn for a maximum of 24 primary and 12 secondary for a grand total of 36 points. Now, for some reason, there's like this massive amount of community vitriol for ITC, and I don't really know where that's coming from. The format itself is competitively minded, but still includes the secondary objective system that Games Workshop adopted for the GT format. And, I mean, it's just a mission structure. It just tells you where to go on the table. You can play it however you want. If you want to play it with funsies armies, it works just fine for that. If you don't, you don't. I think maybe part of it was ITC and their ranking system made casual players going to competitive events feel a little bit left out. And that's where part of the angst over ITC came from. I don't know if it was directed specifically at the mission structure, but I've seen some people say some very mean things about ITC that I don't think are particularly earned. Now, obviously, part of the premise of this video is that the GT format has some big problems that need to be addressed before it can really be taken seriously as a competitive format. I talked about the Goonhammer article, talking about first turn advantage, and that's the big one. Right now, it feels like first turn advantage is sort of an insurmountable obstacle, except for the factions that can use it well. Specifically, Harlequins have access to 3 separate redeploys, I believe. They have 2 stratagems that can redeploy up to 3 units. And between that and their speed and resilience, they are able to pull themselves back into cover if they don't win the roll to go first, and they can still essentially alpha strike you immediately, regardless of whether or not they go first or second. Now, their going first win rate is still better, but they also still have a positive going second win rate, one of the only 2 factions, I believe, to actually have that. Another issue with the GT format, I think, is the primary objective scoring system. It incentivizes players, A, to play extremely aggressively, which is fine, honestly. But it also requires that you be hyper-resilient in order to remain on objectives for multiple rounds in order to score those primary objective points. And not every faction can do that. That's just how it is. Especially if your level of resilience doesn't match up with the damage output that other factions are able to pull out. You don't have any recourse. There's no way to sit back and play a more defensive game to try to bait your opponent out, and then you can use your more lightly armored units, you know, to hit them back and actually play a tactical game like that. If you're not on the primary objectives, you're losing, and if your opponent can kill them off of them, you're going to lose the game. Straight up, period. There's the end of story. There's no counterplay. And so that's created sort of this toxic hyper-resilience meta where the entire game is about piece trading, and either you win if you can stop your opponent from successfully trading for your pieces, or you can kill all of their stuff. And so the game sort of devolves into the biggest and beefiest units running into the center of the table over and over until one side eventually wins, which I'm sure is fun for some people, but there's not really any maneuvering or posturing that needs to be made there. You're just running your guys to the objectives, and that's it. This sort of folds into my next point, which is that this format really dictates the flow of the game. Both players are required to be aggressive in order to score primary objective points, so you have to be moving aggressively towards the center, and that's it. That's the only option that you have. That's compounded by some of the issues of the format itself. The secondary objectives are just broken right now. A lot of them are either way too powerful, a lot of them are way underpowered. Any full round action might as well be ignored. And things like Abhor the Witch give an additional bonus to some factions that were already doing well, whereas a lot of the psychic-oriented factions right now that will typically bring a lot of psychers aren't really doing that well, and there's just a secondary objective you can take to smash them harder. Why is that in there? I don't know. It doesn't really rebalance a lot of the psychic secondary objectives, which are absolutely useless. Psychic Ritual, I think, is the only reasonable one. And if your opponent counterplays it well, you just lose 15 points straight up. So those really need to be addressed. Now, that is something that I think can be fixed, but I don't know how you maintain the bones of the format and repair this first turn and aggressive play issue. Now, the last issue, I think, is with Games Workshop itself. Clearly, one of the reasons that the GT format is being pushed is so that Games Workshop can publish books with all of the changes in it. That means that the format is going to be very slow to adapt because Games Workshop probably will be remiss to make sweeping balance changes in an FAQ. Well, I'm sure they may do that if there's something really super broken. They can't kind of overhaul the system just in an FAQ document, and they would need to wait for a new publishing cycle to republish the book, which then, you have to buy again, and the cycle goes on forever and ever. Now, if the format was great, I wouldn't really have a problem with this, but the problem is that it feels like it's still kind of in a playtest format, and a lot of these balance issues haven't been corrected, and having to wait a full year for the GT2021 packet to repair these balance issues is very frustrating. And if it goes on into the future and we don't see really significant overhauls in GT2021, I mean, it's hard to maintain enthusiasm for a game with that kind of cycle. Now, obviously, there are some advantages to GT2020. I mentioned before that the aggressive playstyle is fine. It's good that a mission format punishes passive playstyles because while that playstyle is more defensively oriented, it should never score more points than somebody moving out and aggressively taking space and grabbing objectives. And that's great. I love that. The problem is that a lot of factions that are able to aggressively take space are not then also hyper-resilient and have a tough time actually maintaining that lead, which is something that they could do in ITC. Now, the gameplay of GT2020 is also much shorter. From the roll to go first to the end of round 5, it's pretty quick. The shorter board and dictating a very aggressive playstyle means that your stuff is going to run into the middle of the table. Most of the combat is going to be done by round 2. Round 3, 4, 5 are mostly wrap up. Now, there is a little asterisk here, which is that the deployment step actually takes a lot longer than it did in the ITC format. ITC had a deploy first, go first structure in their 2020 packet. So the player who won the roll to go first, which was happened before deployment, would deploy all of their models first. Then, as part of an advantage to going second, the player going second would then deploy all their models. And that way of setting up the game is actually much faster than the GT format. So while the GT format, I think, cuts maybe 20 or 30 minutes off the end of the game, unfortunately, I think it adds that back in deployment. The deployment is probably 15-ish minutes longer than it really needs to be. So why exactly would ITC, or the ITC 2020 format specifically, be better than the current GT format? I mentioned the deployment issue. The deploy first, go first format is much, much better than the current GT format, which is sort of simultaneous deployment. It's faster, it gives more of an advantage to the second player to mitigate the first player's alpha strike potential. If you know that you're going second, you can more naturally deploy defensively and then break out from that position. So it also means that factions that don't have access to redeploys aren't super screwed. One of the reasons that Harlequins are so good right now and that their going second win rate is so great is because they have excellent redeployability on top of having fast units. And that's mitigated a little bit. Redeploy still has an advantage in that ITC deploy first, go first deployment, since if you're going first, you can then react to the second player's deployment. But on the flip side, it's not, super game breaking. ITC is also entirely constructed around scoring points to up your score to try to beat out your opponent's score. And from a very basal game design standpoint, this is better than the GT format. GT is very much about denying your opponent points so that they cannot score as much as you. And a lot of games that score 45 versus 45 on primaries come down to the ability to deny your opponent scoring their secondary objectives. In ITC, while that dynamic is still there to a small extent, the goal of games in ITC is to run your guys onto objectives to get yourself points, not to stop your opponent from scoring points. And that, it's just more fun. I like having the number go up, and I don't want to be playing for the number to stop going down. It's not as fun to me. ITC also allows for a wider variety of playstyles to be relevant. I talked about it a million times. GT2020 requires you to be pretty aggressive. You can play a passive game for maybe 1 or 2 turns, but other than that, you have to go out and fight. So gunline armies are significantly at a significant disadvantage. In addition to the core mechanics hurting them right now, like Tau, for example, have a really tough time. Astra Militarum having a real tough time as well. All of these factions are ones that are based around playing a defensive game, and that is just not something you can do in the GT packet, while it is in ITC. Now, ITC still punishes the defensive playstyle. It's way harder to hold more points and maneuver secondaries when you're playing that defensive playstyle. Now, I do think that in a perfect world, and were I to rewrite the ITC packet, I would mitigate that advantage a little bit more to force the game to be a little bit more aggressive. But all these factions should have a legitimate playstyle in a tournament format. The fact that every faction has a decent playstyle also just leads to better balance in general. Now, obviously, the top crust of the meta in any format is always going to be basically the same. Individual faction power is one of the #1 determiners for winning in 40k. So even if we were playing GT 2020, back in February, Space Marines would still be winning. And if we were playing ITC now, I think Harlequins would still be advantaged. But other factions would also have their hat in the ring. The fact that the games were elongated and scoring wasn't so concentrated in those primary objective points allowed for some more interesting strategic play as well. One of the most important skills in playing an ITC format was determining who the aggressive and defensive seat were. This is very much like a Magic the Gathering philosophy. In Magic the Gathering, one of the most important things that you can do is determining whether or not you're the aggro or control seat at any one game. And that is something that ITC actually basically exactly did. Some factions that could sit back and shoot or could project very long melee threat ranges out through the center of the table could afford to play a relatively defensive control-oriented game. Whereas that then put the impetus on the other player to then take the aggressive role and try to take board space in the center, then spearhead out on future turns. That decision-making process was super interesting. And the games where you saw good players correctly recognize whatever their seat on the table was and play accordingly were really super fun to watch. Sometimes you saw very aggressive armies play hyper defensively in some matchups, or vice versa, and requiring players to have a transformational game plan like that to play out specific matchups was really cool and really interesting from a tactical standpoint, and is not something you can do in GT. In GT, you have to play aggressively all the time, every game, otherwise you're gonna die. This was assisted by the fact that ITC games actually lasted a little bit longer in terms of battle rounds. They ran 6 battle rounds, and since a lot of scoring happened at the end of your turn rather than the beginning of your turn, you were able to score points on all 6 of those battle rounds, which meant that you have more chances to score 2 more rounds of scoring essentially in ITC versus GT. That meant that a lot of factions could afford to compress themselves early game to stop their opponent from getting an alpha strike, and after they played 1 or 2 rounds of attrition, they could start to move out on the table to secure their score in the later game. That was another really important skill in ITC, determining whether or not your list or your play in a particular matchup needed to be focused on late game scoring or early game scoring, and a lot of different factions were much better at one of the two. Weaknesses in mind, that brings us to the ultimate question: should the 40k community move back to the ITC format? And it is an interesting question. A lot of people, I think, would like to give Games Workshop the benefit of the doubt and allow them a second iteration on their GT format before making a decision one way or another. Now, to be fair, that means that we would be waiting for GT 2021 probably in June of 2021. And 6 more months to wait for a new GT packet to come out is a long time. Assuming that the current trends in win rates stay the same, and I don't currently see any reason why they wouldn't, we'd be seeing a hyper imbalanced meta for a really long time. And if Games Workshop doesn't really want to do anything to fix it, I don't know if waiting on them for so long is really something that we want to do as a competitive game. Now, personally, I think that it would behoove the competitive community of 40k to move back to an ITC style format, at least until such time that Games Workshop gets their act together and releases a comprehensive format that doesn't have these same glaring issues that GT does. Now, whether or not the community as a whole would accept that is an entirely different question, and I know a lot of people are excited by the fact that 40k now has a global format that every tournament is using. I think that that further kind of compounds the issue that if that particular global format does have imbalances, now there's essentially no recourse, and that's, I think, the situation that we're in right now. Now, I'd be a bit worried about tying the fate of the competitive community directly to Games Workshop. Games Workshop has never been an organization that designs its games to be competitively oriented, and so having the community have control over that aspect of the game, I think, was good. Generally speaking, I think the community, at least in 40k, will have a better grasp of the balance of the game than Games Workshop. And if all they're doing is making minor tweaks to the mission format to compensate, I think that could be an excellent thing for the game. Consistency is really at the heart of any competitive tabletop gaming venture. I don't think that the competitive 40k community, well, being the largest competitive community in tabletop gaming, is in fact big enough to support a great many separate formats. And so having a global consensus on the format is good regardless of what that format is going to be. That helps inform players and compare skill levels across the entire world rather than each community being sheltered within their own format. So ultimately, it comes down to a choice of the community, whether or not they want to accept any alternate formats besides Games Workshop. Obviously, my feeling is that I think ITC would be more beneficial to 40k than the current GT format is, but I don't think everyone's going to share that opinion, and I really hope that Games Workshop takes the opportunity to take the lessons that ITC spent so much time learning and building into their format, and is able to apply those to their games in a timely manner, so that we can have an evolving and interesting GT format for future iterations of 40k. So that's going to be it for this video. Something a little bit different for the channel, but it's a question that has been bouncing around in my head for the last couple days, and I really wanted to talk about it. Let me know what you think on this particular issue down in the comments. Were you a fan of ITC? Do you think ITC would work well in the 9th edition format? I think 9th edition 40k is such a step up from 8th edition that it's a real shame that we're seeing these big balance issues come out of specifically its tournament format. The new terrain rules, the updated core rules, the rebalancing that Games Workshop's trying to do with toning down some of the new Space Marine units and giving each faction their own unique mechanical identity, that is all incredible, and I have such high hopes for the game in the future. It just sucks that we're at a situation right now where all that good work is being dragged down by a subpar tournament format. As always, big thanks to my patrons. You can join them over at patreon.com/tacticaltortoise and get all sorts of cool benefits. We just recently started having patrons vote for the new topics in the Datasheet Deep Dive series, so if you want to have your voice heard and let me know what you want, you can join the patrons and let me know in one of the suggestion threads that we're putting up on the feed right now. We also have a new YouTube membership. You can join the link down below the video. You get some cool badges and emojis and stuff that you can use. Thanks again for watching all the way through to the end of the video. I really appreciate it. Remember to have a good one, everybody. Keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.